Apple. You bite into a raw apple and your lips tingle and the roof of your mouth goes itchy, and within 20 minutes it has passed. Almost everybody blames the apple. The apple has almost nothing to do with it. What your immune system is reacting to is a protein called MALD1, and the reason it cares is that MALD1 looks almost identical to BET-V1, the main protein in birch pollen. If you are allergic to birch, your antibodies were trained on the pollen. The apple simply resembles it closely enough to trip the same alarm. The name for this is oral allergy syndrome, and it is nowhere near as rare as it sounds. More than 70% of people sensitized to birch pollen react to apple. Worldwide, pollen-related food allergy touches somewhere around 70 million people. One thing to keep in mind for everything that follows. Every prevalence figure here is an estimate from a sampled population rather than a head count. The cost of this one is misattribution. People spend years believing they cannot tolerate fruit, when what they actually have is hay fever wearing a disguise, and the protein falls apart under heat, which is why the same apple baked into a pie does nothing at all. Dust mites. You wake up congested and you assume it is a cold, and then it happens again the next morning, and the morning after that. A cold does not run for 4 years. House dust mites are microscopic arachnids living in mattresses and pillows and upholstery, feeding on the skin cells you shed. And here is the part almost nobody knows. You are not allergic to the mite. The main allergen is called DERP1, and it is a digestive enzyme concentrated in the fecal pellets the mite leaves behind. A mattress is less a nest than a latrine, and what you breathe in every night is the droppings. Between 65 and 130 million people worldwide have this allergy, and it is the most common allergic trigger on Earth. Around half of everyone with allergic asthma or allergic rhinitis reacts to it, and among people sensitized to dust mite, somewhere between 80 and 100% carry antibodies aimed specifically at DERP1. The cost is that the trigger is where you sleep. Symptoms peak in the morning because you have just spent 8 hours face down in the source, and that is exactly the pattern that makes people call it a cold instead of an allergy. Nickel. There is a faint itch under a watch strap, or a red ring where a belt buckle sits, or an earlobe that turns sore with certain earrings. Almost nobody calls that an allergy. They call it cheap metal. Nickel is the single most common contact allergen in the world. In the European general population, the age standardized rate is around 14.5%, running from about 8% in Sweden to 18.5% in Portugal. In children and adolescents, it is already running at 8 to 10%. It affects women somewhere between 4 and 10 times more often than men, and the reason is not biological. It is piercings. Which sets up the strangest fact here. Denmark regulated how much nickel jewelry is allowed to release, and researchers then compared girls whose ears were pierced before the rules with girls pierced after. The rate fell from 17% to under 4%. That is an allergy whose prevalence was cut by a piece of legislation. The cost is that nickel is in coins and phone cases and glasses frames and zips. So people who react to it spend years assembling a private list of things they cannot wear, without ever learning there is one word for all of it. Red meat. You eat a steak at 7 in the evening and you wake at 1 in the morning covered in hives and nothing connects the two. This is alpha-gal syndrome, and the delay is the entire reason it hides. Alpha-gal is a sugar molecule, galactose alpha-1,3 galactose, and it is present in the meat of almost every mammal. It is not present in you. An ancestral primate lost the gene that builds it, which is the only reason your immune system is capable of treating it as foreign. And the way people become allergic is a tick bite. Alpha-gal turns up in the saliva of the Lone Star tick, and the bite delivers it straight into skin, and the immune system starts building antibodies against a sugar it has been eating in food its whole life, without complaint. After that, the reaction arrives 2 to 10 hours after a meal instead of within minutes. The reason for the delay is mechanical. The alpha-gal is bound to fat, so it has to be digested and absorbed before it ever reaches the bloodstream. The cost is that this breaks the one rule everybody knows about food allergy, which is that the reaction is immediate. People spend years being investigated for hives of unknown cause. Sunlight. The first properly hot weekend of the year arrives, and an itchy bumpy rash appears on the chest and the arms and the backs of the hands. Everybody calls it heat rash. It is polymorphic light eruption, and it is a reaction to ultraviolet light rather than to heat. It is the most common of all the sun-related skin conditions, running at up to 20% of people in Central Europe, Scandinavia, and the United States. Among Northern European women taking holidays in the Mediterranean, the figure sits between 20 and 40%. It is roughly 4 times more common in women, and it usually starts in the 20s or 30s. And it has one feature that almost guarantees it stays misread. As the summer goes on, repeated exposure makes the skin less reactive, and dermatologists call that hardening. So the rash appears in May, and gets milder in June, and is gone by July. The person concludes it was a one-off caused by the weather. The cost is a decade of the same cycle before anybody puts a name on it. And it is worth saying what this is not. It is not sunburn, and it is not a reaction to heat. What sets it off is ultraviolet light landing on skin that has had almost none for months, which is why it belongs to spring rather than to August. Cold. Hives on the forearms after washing up in cold water, or a swollen lip after an iced drink. And the usual explanation is dry skin or wind. Cold urticaria is a reaction to a change in temperature rather than to any substance. It is diagnosed with the simplest test in this entire field. An ice cube goes on the forearm for a few minutes and then comes off. If a hive rises in the exact shape of the ice cube, the test is positive and the wheal usually appears as the skin rewarms. This is not a curiosity. In a study of 551 patients, 75% had a positive cold stimulation test. Of those, 37% had experienced a cold-induced anaphylactic reaction. Across the wider literature, up to 72% of patients report at least one whole-body reaction after a heavy cold exposure. Swimming is the most common trigger of a whole-body reaction because immersion cools an enormous area of skin at once, and there are deaths on record. The cost is the mismatch between how trivial the trigger sounds and how serious the systemic version actually is. Banana. Somebody notices their mouth itches with banana, and separately their hands react to rubber gloves, and the two facts never get filed together. They are the same allergy. Natural rubber latex contains a protein called hevine, and hevine belongs to a family of plant defense proteins called class 1 chitinases. Banana and avocado and kiwi and chestnut all make chitinases of their own. They are close enough in shape that antibodies raised against latex bind to them as well. The banana version is called MUSA2, and the avocado version is PERS-A1, and neither plant has anything to do with rubber. They simply solve the same defensive problem in the same way. This is latex fruit syndrome, and somewhere between 30 and 50% of people allergic to latex react to at least one of those foods. The direction runs both ways, so a fruit reaction can be the first visible sign of a latex problem that has not shown itself yet. The cost sits in hospitals rather than kitchens. Latex is in gloves and catheters and dental dams, and somebody who only knows they have trouble with avocado has no reason at all to mention it before a procedure. Exercise. Somebody has an anaphylactic reaction after a run. They have run hundreds of times before with no problem. They eat bread every day with no problem. The reaction makes no sense until you realize it needs both. Wheat-dependent exercise-induced anaphylaxis is a reaction to a wheat protein called omega-5 gliadin, and it only fires when the wheat is followed by a cofactor. In a study of 132 adults, the cofactor was exercise in 80% of cases, alcohol in 25%, and anti-inflammatory painkillers in 9%. 11% had no identifiable cofactor at all. Because the same person tolerates wheat perfectly well on any ordinary day, the pattern looks random for years. In that same study, 40% waited between 1 and 5 years for a diagnosis, and 29% waited longer than 5. The cost is the delay on a condition whose reactions are severe by definition. The authors of that study ended up recommending that every adult presenting with anaphylaxis of unclear cause simply be tested for omega-5 gliadin antibodies, because the history alone will not find it. Somebody can describe the same lunch 100 times without ever mentioning that the 101st was followed by a run. Histamine intolerance. This one is here because it is not an allergy at all. The claim is that some people cannot break down dietary histamine efficiently, usually blamed on low activity of an enzyme called diamine oxidase, and that the histamine then accumulates and produces symptoms resembling an allergic reaction. The distinction that matters is dose. A real allergy is antibody-driven, and a trace amount is enough, which is why a peanut allergy can react to contamination. Histamine intolerance, if it works the way it is described, is cumulative. A small amount does nothing, and a large one does. Here is the honest status. There is no standardized diagnostic criterion, the blood test for that enzyme has never been validated as a diagnostic tool, and systematic reviews describe the evidence base as low quality and largely uncontrolled. Early estimates put it mere 1% of people, and newer ones range from 3 to 6, and a spread that wide tells you how unsettled the whole thing is. The cost is the misfiling. Somebody convinced they have an allergy stops looking for whatever is actually going on. Seminal Plasma. Human seminal plasma hypersensitivity is a real, documented allergy, and it is one of the most consistently misidentified conditions in this field. The allergen has been identified as prostate-specific antigen, the same PSA measured in prostate screening. It is a protein, and in some women the immune system treats it as foreign. A systematic review published in 2024 concluded that the condition is both more common and more frequently misdiagnosed than had been assumed, with most cases appearing in women in their 20s and 30s. And there is a cross-reaction here that nobody would predict. Human PSA is structurally similar to canine prostatic kallikrein. which is one of the allergens in dog dander and dog urine. So some of the women who react to seminal plasma appear to have been sensitized by a dog. The condition also splits into two forms. In the localized version, the reaction stays where the contact happened, and in the systemic version, it behaves like any other whole-body allergic reaction. The cost is that the symptoms get attributed to almost anything else first, and the person carrying it has no reason to suspect that an allergy is involved. Water, aquagenic urticaria, is hives triggered by contact with water itself, not cold water and not hot water. Water, rain does it, sweat does it, and in some cases tears do it. Wheals usually appear 20 to 30 minutes after contact, and the temperature makes no difference, which is exactly what separates it from the cold reaction. It is genuinely extremely rare. Fewer than 100 cases exist in the entire medical literature, and one systematic review could assemble only 77 patients out of 59 separate publications. It shows up more often in women, and it usually begins around or after puberty. The mechanism is still not settled, and this is one of the very few allergies where nobody can confidently name the allergen at all. The leading proposals involve something in the skin generating a soluble trigger on contact with water, rather than the water acting as an allergen directly. The cost here is not misattribution, because a rash from rain is hard to explain away. It is that the condition is rare enough that most physicians will never see a single case, and the person lives without an explanation in the meantime. Penicillin. This is the allergy you probably think you have and probably do not. Around 10% of people carry a penicillin allergy label. Fewer than 1% of people are genuinely allergic to it. When those labeled patients are formally tested, more than 90% turn out not to be allergic at all. And the reason the label is so often wrong is almost always the same story. A child gets an infection, and the infection itself produces a rash, because in childhood, viral infections are the most common cause of rashes. The child has also been given amoxicillin. The rash gets attributed to the drug. The label goes into the notes, and it stays there for the next 60 years. The cost is the part people do not expect. A penicillin allergy label means being given broader spectrum antibiotics instead. Those are more likely to fail, more likely to cause side effects, and more likely to drive resistance. The label on its own is associated with worse outcomes. So the last item here is an allergy that mostly does not exist, and it is doing more measurable harm than most of the ones that do. That gap is not unique to penicillin. Nearly 1 in 5 American adults says they have a food allergy. When the diagnostic criteria are actually applied, the figure is closer to 1 in 9. So roughly half the people who believe they have a food allergy do not, while a large number of people with the ones you have just heard about have no idea they do. An allergy is not a fact about a substance. It is a mistake your immune system made once about a protein that was never a threat and then filed permanently. It is not reading the world correctly. It is repeating an old error very precisely. If you made it to the end, comment cleared, because most people carrying that penicillin label turn out to be exactly that.